My Lai Massacre. On the 16th of March 1968, in the Vietnamese village called Sun Mai, U.S. soldiers carried out what became the largest massacre of civilians by American forces in the 20th century. Between 347 and 504 unarmed villagers, most of them women, children, and the elderly, were killed. Many women and girls, some as young as 12, were raped before being murdered. Bodies were mutilated, homes were burned, and livestock was slaughtered. Witnesses described women using their bodies to shield children, only for soldiers to fire into them. One ditch alone held more than 70 dead. Then, platoons went hut to hut, killing entire families, bayoneting the wounded, and throwing grenades. Soldiers later testified that their orders had been to destroy everything, leave nothing, and treat anyone still there as the enemy. One soldier intentionally shot himself in the foot to avoid taking part. A few, like Michael Bernhardt, refused to kill and later helped expose what happened. The massacre might have been even worse if not for Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson Jr. and his helicopter crew. Flying low over the village, they saw women and children being slaughtered, and at one point, Thompson landed between U.S. soldiers and terrified civilians, ordering his own gunners to fire on Americans if they kept killing. He personally evacuated survivors by helicopter, saving dozens. At first, the massacre was reported as a great victory, claiming that 128 Viet Cong were killed, and the unit was congratulated. Officers up the chain of command worked to hide the truth, but later on, when veterans like Ronald Ridenhour spoke out and journalist Seymour Hersh investigated, the world learned the real story. When photographs surfaced showing women, children, and babies piled in ditches, what happened could no longer be denied. In the end, 26 soldiers were charged, but only one, Lieutenant Calley, was convicted. He was found guilty of murdering 22 villagers and sentenced to life in prison, but he served 3.5 years under house arrest after President Nixon intervened. Medina, accused of giving the orders, was acquitted. Most others escaped punishment. Survivors, many of them children at the time, carried the trauma for decades. One recalled, "Everyone in my family was killed. They threw me into a ditch full of dead bodies. I was covered with blood and brains." Haditha Massacre. On the morning of November 19, 2005, in the Iraqi town of Haditha, a roadside bomb tore through a U.S. Marine convoy. The explosion killed a Marine instantly and left 2 other Marines badly wounded. Within hours, that turned into one of the darkest chapters of the Iraq War. The Marines shot 5 unarmed men who had been ordered out of their taxi, killing them on the spot. Then, they entered nearby houses. Inside were families with grandparents, parents, and children as young as 1 year old. Nonetheless, 19 civilians were killed in their homes, most shot at close range in the chest or head. By the end of the day, 25 unarmed civilians were dead, with the youngest victim being just 3 years old. The Marine Corps' first official story was false. They claimed that 15 civilians had been killed by the roadside bomb and that 8 insurgents died in a firefight afterward. However, an Iraqi human rights worker filmed the aftermath: bullet holes in walls, bloodstains on floors, and bodies of women and children with gunshot wounds. A Time magazine reporter then began investigating and found that doctors at the local hospital confirmed that none of the bodies showed bomb injuries, but close-range gunshot wounds. A 9-year-old girl who survived said she saw her grandfather shot first in the chest and then in the head, followed by her grandmother. Investigations stretched on for years, and at first, 8 Marines were charged, but case after case collapsed. Some Marines received immunity in exchange for testimony, while others had their charges dropped. By 2008, nearly all charges were gone, and the only Marine punished was Vuteric. He admitted to negligent dereliction of duty, lost rank and pay, but avoided jail. For many Iraqis, this outcome was unbearable, as families who had lost multiple relatives in one morning saw 6 years of U.S. military prosecution end without a single Marine imprisoned. Survivors called it an assault on humanity. Lawyers for the victims urged international courts to take up the case. Meanwhile, the U.S. military paid $38,000 in compensation to some families. Samar Campaign. Kill everyone over the age of 10. Those were the words of General Jacob H. Smith during the Philippine-American War in what became known as the Pacification of Samar. His order did not apply only to armed enemy fighters, but to everyone, as he wanted to turn the island into, in his own words, a howling wilderness. The situation leading up to this was already tense, as just months earlier, Filipino fighters together with local townspeople had carried out the Balangiga massacre, where in a surprise attack, they killed 54 and wounded 18 U.S. soldiers. That's when the U.S. government sent General Smith to Samar, who made it clear that he wanted no prisoners and asked for everyone capable of bearing arms to be killed. When Marines asked him what exactly capable of bearing arms meant, Smith explained that it meant boys as young as 10 years old. Waller himself, The major leading these Marines partly resisted these instructions, telling some of his officers not to target women and children. Still, over just 11 days, he reported that his men burned 255 homes and killed 39 people. Civilians saw their towns and food reduced to ashes. The number of deaths will never be fully known, but broader estimates suggest around 2,000 to 2,500 civilians were killed. The campaign became infamous in the United States once reports reached home, and Smith was put on trial in May 1902, but not for murder or war crimes. Instead, he was found guilty only of conduct to the prejudice of good order and military discipline, a minor charge. His punishment was just a formal reprimand. To calm public anger, he was quietly forced into retirement. Waller himself was also later put on trial for ordering the execution of Filipino porters, but he was acquitted. Nisour Square Massacre. This one was different from the others. It happened without warning, and not by the regular US Army, but by a private contractor known as Blackwater, which made it even more controversial. On a normal morning in September 2007, a Blackwater convoy drove into Nisour Square in Baghdad to clear a route for US officials. Moments later, though, out of nowhere, they opened fire on Iraqi civilians. 17 people were killed, and 20 more were wounded. Some were shot while still sitting in their cars. For example, witnesses described one small Kia with a mother and her adult son inside. The son was shot in the head, and the car kept moving forward and was riddled with more bullets before a grenade set it on fire. Blackwater claimed the convoy had been ambushed and that the guards fired in self-defense, but the Iraqi government called it an unprovoked attack. The State Department admitted that innocent people had been killed, and Iraq suspended Blackwater's license to operate in its territory and demanded accountability. Several investigations began, and a U.S. military report supported Iraq's version of events, saying Blackwater was at fault. The FBI concluded that at least 14 of the 17 people killed had been shot without justification. Some Blackwater guards themselves told investigators that the shooting was wrong. One guard even kept firing after others shouted for him to stop, until another contractor aimed his weapon at him to force him to stand down. The massacre raised questions about the role of private military contractors, and Iraq demanded punishment for Blackwater and pressed for compensation. In the U.S., the House passed a bill to bring contractors under U.S. criminal law in war zones, though the Senate did not vote on it. Then, the State Department told Blackwater its security contract would not be renewed, and years later, the case reached U.S. courts. In 2014, 4 Blackwater guards were convicted in federal court. One of them was sentenced to life in prison, while the others received 30 years each under firearms laws. There were some appeals, but in the end, the man originally sentenced to life was once again given life in prison, while the other 3 had their sentences reduced to about half of what they were before. Later on, however, there was a final twist. In December 2020, President Donald Trump pardoned all 4 men. The decision triggered outrage in Iraq and harsh criticism from United Nations experts, who said the pardons violated U.S. obligations under international law. Abu Ghraib. The photos from Abu Ghraib are widely known around the world for how disturbing they look, but the background is even darker. To the public, Abu Ghraib was a normal detention and interrogation facility, but it wasn't at all. Inside, there was sexual humiliation to lengths we can't go to for obvious reasons: torture, physical abuse, and rape. There was even the killing of Manadel al-Jamadi, whose body was packed in ice and later photographed with soldiers posing beside it. The shock was immediate and worldwide, so the Bush administration answered quickly, saying that these were isolated acts by a few rogue soldiers. However, organizations like the Red Cross, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch said the opposite, claiming this was part of a larger pattern across U.S. prisons in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Guantanamo. The Red Cross also reported that most Abu Ghraib detainees were civilians with no connection to armed groups. Then, internal documents showed how they were given approval for what were called enhanced interrogation techniques. These documents would be later known as the torture memos, for reasons you can imagine. They argued that the Geneva Conventions didn't apply overseas and didn't classify the detainees as prisoners of war, which allowed them to hold people longer without charges and deny them the rights normally given to prisoners of war. Other orders showed Lieutenant General Ricardo Sanchez authorizing the use of dogs, extreme heat and cold, reversed sleep cycles, and sensory deprivation. Inside the cells, prisoners were stripped naked and forced into humiliating poses, threatened with dogs, beaten, shackled in painful positions, deprived of sleep and warmth, and forced into sexual acts. Taguba recorded one prisoner sodomized with a chemical light. Detainees spoke of acid poured on their skin, being dragged by ropes tied to their genitals, and being mocked. Manadel al-Jamadi, whose death was ruled a homicide, never led to any criminal charges. At the same time, 36 detainees died in insurgent mortar attacks on the prison, which critics said violated the Geneva rule that prisoners should not be kept in active combat zones. In 2006, the Supreme Court ruled that the Geneva Conventions did apply, and 17 soldiers and officers were removed, while 11 were court-martialed. The punishments varied. One guy got 10 years, some 3, and others shorter sentences, or even just reprimands or demotions. External contractors, such as the company CACI Premier Technology, also came under scrutiny. Pretty recently, in 2024, a jury found them liable for conspiring with military police to soften up prisoners through abuse, awarding 3 former detainees $42 million in damages. Jurors concluded that CACI interrogators facilitated mistreatment even if they did not personally carry it out. Operation Speedy Express. This was one of the most brutal and controversial U.S. campaigns of the Vietnam War. You can get an idea of what really happened when you hear that the Army reported about 11,000 enemy killed, but recovered only 750 weapons from the dead. Operation Speedy Express, carried out from December 1968 to May 1969, and run under Major General Julian Ewell, had the official goal of destroying Viet Cong bases, cutting supply lines, and re-establishing U.S. control over a region considered a stronghold of the Viet Cong, the Mekong Delta. On paper, the operation looked like an overwhelming success, considering that just 242 American soldiers died, while the enemy lost 11,000. With a ratio of 45-1, it looked like a decisive victory, but the numbers hid something darker. The fact that only about 750 weapons were recovered means that thousands of those killed were probably unarmed civilians. The Army's own Inspector General later estimated that between 5,000 and 7,000 civilians were killed during the operation. The campaign relied on overwhelming firepower, like helicopter gunships, artillery barrages, and fighter bomber strikes, in a heavily crowded region with civilians. This basically turned entire areas into free fire zones. David Hackworth, a highly decorated battalion commander, admitted openly, "A lot of innocent Vietnamese civilians got slaughtered because of the Yule Hunt drive to have the highest body count in the land." Survivors and witnesses described whole villages wiped out, with civilians getting shot from the air as they tried to run. A Viet Cong commander later explained, "Most of the people killed were civilians, because civilians would run. We soldiers held our positions." Reports of atrocities began to surface in 1969, but they were overshadowed by the My Lai massacre, which we've just talked about. In 1972, Newsweek published an investigation by Kevin Buckley and Alexander Shimkin called Pacification's Deadly Price. They had interviewed villagers and studied hospital records. In one provincial hospital, they found that 3/4 of the civilian wounds treated came from U.S. firepower, not Viet Cong attacks. Their conclusion was that thousands of civilians had been killed during Speedy Express. No Gun Ri Massacre. In the summer of 1950, during the Korean War, one of its darkest tragedies took place at a railway bridge near the village of No Gun Ri. U.S. commanders were afraid that North Korean soldiers were disguising themselves as civilians, so they ordered refugee movements to be blocked. Declassified documents later showed that some commands actually went even further, authorizing troops to fire on groups of civilians who approached. Then, disaster struck. As waves of refugees fled south from the advancing North Korean army, they reached U.S. lines. There, they were stopped, searched, and grouped near the railway tracks by No Gun Ri. American planes then shot at them. Survivors say ground troops soon opened fire too, driving them into the culverts and pinning them down in the bridge underpasses. Hundreds of South Korean refugees, mostly women, children, and the elderly, were caught under fire, and for 3 days, families screamed as they piled bodies on top of one another for cover, drank from a stream turned red with blood, and watched children die beside them. The death toll has long been debated, with survivors speaking of about 400 people killed, and U.S. veterans giving numbers ranging from dozens to several hundred. A South Korean government inquiry was able to confirm 163 people dead or missing by name, along with 55 wounded, and concluded that the real toll was likely much higher, around 250 to 300. Nearly half of the confirmed victims were children. For decades, the story was silenced, as survivors lived in fear under South Korea's authoritarian governments. It was not until 1999 that the Associated Press exposed the story worldwide, interviewing survivors and U.S. veterans. The reporting won a Pulitzer Prize and forced both the U.S. and South Korean governments to investigate. The U.S. Army's 2001 report admitted that civilians had been killed by American air and ground fire, but claimed there had been no orders to deliberately massacre them. It described the killings as a tragic accident of war. President Bill Clinton expressed deep regret and admitted things happened which were wrong. Instead of compensation, the U.S. funded a memorial and scholarships, which survivors rejected. South Korean investigators, however, concluded that there had almost certainly been orders to fire, pointing to missing records, consistent testimony, and orders from the time to treat refugees as enemy agents. Later, more declassified documents strengthened the case. One was a letter dated July 26, 1950, from the U.S. ambassador in Seoul, reporting that the U.S. military had adopted a policy of shooting refugee groups approaching its lines. This and other incriminating records had been deliberately left out of the Army's official report. No Gun-ri also set off wider investigations in South Korea, uncovering more than 200 other cases of alleged U.S. killings of civilians in the early years of the war, including refugee bombings and mass executions. Sand Creek Massacre. On November 29, 1864, troops under Colonel John Chivington rode toward a Native American camp of the Cheyenne and Arapaho people. Chief Black Kettle had moved his people there after being told it was safe, and he raised a U.S. flag with a white flag underneath it to show peace. Many of the warriors were away, and most of the people in camp were too old or too young to fight. Despite this, Chivington's soldiers attacked. Witnesses later described women and children being shot at close range, people cut apart with knives, babies killed, and bodies mutilated for trophies. One account told of a child wandering in the sand while soldiers took turns trying to shoot him. Another described fingers and ears cut off for jewelry and the body of Chief White Antelope butchered. By the time the killing ended, most of the dead were women and children. Chivington claimed that 500 to 600 warriors were killed, boasting about the number, but other sources said the real number was closer to 150, with about 2/3 women and children. The soldiers suffered far fewer losses. Before leaving, they looted the lodges and returned to kill some of the wounded. The reason why this massacre happened in the first place is even sadder. In the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, the U.S. recognized a large Cheyenne and Arapaho homeland. But after the Colorado Gold Rush and new migration, they asked the natives for more land than was agreed, and a small group of chiefs signed the Fort Wise Treaty, ceding most of the land to appease the U.S. Many Cheyenne, though, rejected it as invalid, and tensions rose. The governor told friendly Indians to gather near forts in order to stay safe, and Colonel Chivington himself, while he declared openly that he had come to kill Indians, told those seeking peace to come under military protection at Fort Lyon. That's exactly what Black Kettle did, following his instructions, but his people were pushed out. He still believed the U.S. and white flags would protect them, but the massacre happened. In Colorado and Washington, the story was first reported as a victory, but the truth quickly surfaced. 3 investigations followed, including a congressional inquiry that called it a foul and dastardly massacre. Officers and scouts testified about the killings and mutilations. Captain Soule, who had refused to fire, gave evidence and was murdered shortly after in Denver. Despite the findings, no one was court-martialed. Chivington had already resigned, and while his career ended in disgrace, he avoided legal punishment. A later treaty at the Little Arkansas promised survivors land access and reparations, but those promises were soon broken and replaced with much smaller reservations. Philippines concentration camps. During the Philippine-American War, concentration camps were used in Batangas, and one American officer described them as some suburb of hell. You'll soon understand why. Back then, General James Franklin Bell took command of U.S. forces in that area, and his goal was to starve the rebels and cut them off from any support. However, since there were many civilians there, they decided to put them into heavily guarded camps, as their homes, fields, and animals were destroyed. All civilians were required to carry identification papers, and anyone found outside the camps without them could be shot on the spot. Bell himself said neutrality should not be tolerated, which meant that everyone was either an enemy or a friend, and anyone accused of helping the rebels risked execution. Conditions inside the camps were catastrophic. People were packed together in crowded spaces with poor sanitation, which made diseases spread quickly. Cholera, smallpox, beriberi, and even bubonic plague killed thousands. Food was also scarce, and some soldiers described groups of men being forced to dig their own graves before being executed, with the excuse that keeping them alive would take food away from U.S. troops. Torture was also performed, such as waterboarding. The death toll was incredible. Between January and April 1902, 8,350 people died in the camps. In some camps, as many as 1 out of every 5 prisoners died. To calm public anger in the United States, the Army's top public relations officer tried to defend the camps. He claimed they were meant to protect friendly natives, feed them, and teach them better hygiene. However, this claim collapsed when reports from inside the camp surfaced, with letters from soldiers and witnesses. Wounded Knee Massacre. Before sunrise at Wounded Knee Creek, cavalry surrounded the Native American band of Lakota and began collecting their guns. Tension grew as soldiers searched the people, and a deaf Lakota man named Black Coyote held onto his rifle, and during a struggle, it went off. In that instant, soldiers opened fire on the entire camp, even though most Lakota men had already been disarmed. The Army's Hotchkiss guns fired into the tents where women and children were hiding. In less than an hour, more than 250 Lakota were killed or fatally wounded. 25 U.S. soldiers were also killed. Survivors tried to flee, but they were chased and shot, and some soldiers finished off the wounded where they lay. A blizzard followed the massacre, and 3 days later, civilians gathered the frozen bodies and placed them in a mass grave. 4 infants were found alive, still wrapped in their mothers' shawls. The Army removed Colonel Forsyth, who had led the operation, but later reinstated him. An inquiry criticized his tactics, but did not blame him. 19 medals of honor were then awarded for Wounded Knee. Native leaders and many others have condemned those awards for decades, but most recently, in 2025, the Defense Secretary announced the medals would not be revoked. Corporal Bill Hatton, a U.S. Marine corporal, admitted that he and other Americans fed Vietnamese children peanut butter cracker sandwiches with trioxane heat tablets hidden inside. The tablets burned the lining of their throats and even burned holes in their stomachs, as trioxane is a solid fuel tablet from military rations used to heat food, and it is not meant to be eaten. The corporal's name was Bill Hatton, and his statement went further than just the heat tablets. He said his unit threw cases of C rations off moving trucks at women and children. He described how they fired mad minutes from their position, a Miria shelter bombing. At 4:30 in the morning on the 13th of February 1991, 2 U.S. Air Force stealth bombers dropped laser-guided bombs on public shelter number 25 in Baghdad's Amiria district. The shelter had been built during the Iran-Iraq War and was used by families for protection. On that night, it was crowded with hundreds of civilians, including women and children, trying to survive the Gulf War air campaign. The first bomb cut through 9.8 feet of reinforced concrete before exploding. Minutes later, the second bomb followed the same path and detonated inside. People outside heard screams for several minutes, then silence. Inside, more than 400 civilians were killed. Those on the upper floors were burned alive instantly, while others died when boiling water from burst tanks scalded them. Survivors described blackened handprints fused to ceilings, corpses melted together into blocks of flesh, and a layer of human fat floating on the water pumped in by firefighters. The U.S. military later said they believed the shelter had been turned into a military command post, and they pointed to intercepted signals and surveillance reports as proof. But even some senior U.S. officers doubted this evidence, calling it circumstantial. Human Rights Watch and journalists who visited the site found no trace of military use, and they reported that the shelter was clearly marked as a civilian refuge. Today, the ruins stand as a memorial, with photographs of the dead on the walls. Charred handprints and burned ceilings remain in place. A woman named Greda, who lost 8 children in the bombing, became the caretaker and guide for visitors. Laconia Incident. On the 12th of September 1942, the German submarine U-156 torpedoed the British ship RMS Laconia off the coast of West Africa. Because the Laconia was armed, it was considered a normal legal military target. But once the submarine's commander, Werner Hartenstein, realized that most of the people in the water were Italian prisoners of war and civilians, he began a rescue effort. He sent open radio messages in English giving his position, promised not to attack, and called for help. Other submarines came to assist and collect the survivors. The rescue scene was chaotic, as the Laconia had tilted so badly that many of its lifeboats could not be launched. Prisoners locked below broke out, and desperate fights erupted as they rushed towards the boats to save their lives. Some men were bayoneted as they tried to reach the boats, while others were slashed or shot when climbing aboard. Sharks circled in the bloody water. U-156 stayed on the surface, carrying nearly 200 survivors on its deck and towing more in lifeboats. Then, on the 16th of September, a US B-24 bomber spotted the submarine. It saw the Red Cross flag and even received signals in English, some from Hartenstein himself, others from a British officer aboard, explaining that there were survivors, including women and children. The aircrew reported this, but their commander ordered an attack. Bombs and depth charges fell among the lifeboats, killing many people, and forced U-156 to release the survivors and dive to save itself. Other submarines continued the rescue, but still, the death toll was staggering. Out of 2,732 people on the Laconia, only about 976 to 1,083 survived, and between 1,658 and 1,757 died, most of them Italian prisoners of war. Meanwhile, the American airmen reported that they had sunk U-156, received medals for the attack, and faced no investigation or punishment. The case was quietly dropped. The bombing of a rescue effort shocked the German Navy, and because of this, on September 17th, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz issued the Laconia Order, forbidding U-boats from rescuing survivors. From then on, German submarines followed a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. The order became a central issue at the Nuremberg trials, where prosecutors argued that Dönitz and his submariners had committed war crimes. However, the move backfired once the full story of the Laconia incident and Allied practices came out. The tribunal criticized the order for being harsh and unclear, but did not add extra punishment to Dönitz's sentence for this charge. Legal experts later judged the American attack on U-156 as a clear example of a war crime. Under international law, enemy submarines rescuing survivors under a Red Cross flag are not lawful targets while doing so. Maiwand Kill Team. A 15-year-old Afghan boy was working in a field when U.S. soldiers threw a grenade at him, shot him, and then posed for photos with his body. The sergeant then cut off his little finger as a trophy. That was the beginning of the Maiwand District murders, a series of killings carried out in 2010 by a self-named Kill Team from the U.S. Army's 3rd Platoon, Bravo Company. A month later, soldiers killed a 22-year-old man, who was later believed to have been deaf or mentally disabled and kept part of his skull. Keeping body parts as trophies was a recurring characteristic of these killings. Then they killed Mullah Adadad with a grenade and gunfire in front of his family. Once again, they amputated a finger and kept it. When local elders complained that Adadad had been unarmed, a platoon leader came back to the village and told residents the man had acted aggressively, insisting the unit did not kill people randomly. However, photos later published by Der Spiegel and Rolling Stone told another story. They showed soldiers smiling over corpses, holding body parts, and even 2 Afghans cuffed together beside a sign that read, "Taliban's are dead." Senior NATO officials in Kabul compared the images to the infamous Abu Ghraib prison photos. The truth finally came out because a soldier reported the crimes to his superiors after he had first been beaten by fellow soldiers for speaking up. Another soldier had also tried to raise alarm months earlier by telling his father, who called military hotlines in the US but got no response. Once the army acted, charges spread across the platoon. 5 soldiers were charged with murder, and 7 more faced charges for drug use, assaults, obstruction, and covering up the crimes. In court, one of them, a 22-year-old soldier, admitted guilt to 3 premeditated murders and told the judge the plan was to kill people. He was sentenced to 24 years and agreed to testify against the others. In the end, 11 of the 12 soldiers charged were convicted of crimes connected to the killings or the cover-up, with some receiving life sentences and others lighter punishments. Phoenix Program. The Phoenix Program was created to find and destroy the Viet Cong's political network hidden among ordinary civilians. The idea was straightforward but ruthless. The Viet Cong were not only strong because of their fighters in the jungle, but they also had a hidden system inside their communities. This infrastructure included people who recruited new members, gathered information, spread propaganda, moved supplies, and replaced local leaders with their own. Phoenix was built to break that system, and it used infiltration, capture, interrogation, and targeted killings. Success was measured by how many people were neutralized, with that word covering different outcomes: prison, defection, or death. From 1968 to 1972, they claimed to have neutralized 81,740 suspected Viet Cong, including 26,369 killed. About 87% of those deaths were officially recorded as happening during regular South Vietnamese and American military operations, while the rest were attributed directly to Phoenix operatives. To carry this out, Phoenix relied on provincial reconnaissance units, or PRUs, and a network of interrogation centers. PRU teams grabbed suspects or raided homes where they believed Viet Cong cadres lived. Then, interrogators tried to force out names and structures for the next round of raids. On paper, there were rules. For example, some special laws said that 3 different sources were needed to accuse someone. In practice, though, things were far harsher. Large sweeps often dragged in innocent people. Information gained under interrogation was used to guide search and destroy missions, and torture was part of the process in South Vietnamese centers, with Americans often supervising. Witnesses later described beatings, electric shocks to genitals, water torture, suspension by ropes, rape, and even deaths during questioning. Some extreme claims about Phoenix were later questioned, but even inside the program's own records, there was no doubt about the larger pattern of cruelty. For example, some Vietnamese rivals accused one another of being Viet Cong to settle old disputes. In response to all of this, North Vietnamese and Viet Cong leaders ordered assassinations of Phoenix staff. Later, anger grew as details leaked out. Journalists, veterans, and former officials spoke against it. Congress held hearings where Phoenix was described as a system of murder without faces or names. The CIA defended defended itself, saying it preferred capturing suspects alive and never officially approved assassinations. Still, public pressure grew, and Phoenix was officially shut down in 1972. A similar program, Plan F6, continued under the South Vietnamese government until the end of the war. Bear River Massacre. At dawn, on a normal day in January, soldiers under Colonel Patrick Edward Connor reached a Native American camp of the Shoshone people. These people had gathered there for the winter because by then, they were already on the edge of survival, as settlers had taken over their land, eaten up their food sources, fenced off fields, and hunted the animals they relied on. Hunger drove some Shoshone to raid farms and supply trains, and settlers asked the army to protect them. Connor, though, wanted a decisive blow. He had already written that he planned to chastise the Shoshone. The Shoshone tried to prepare, digging rifle pits and setting up willow brush as cover, but their weapons were few and often outdated. At first, they held off the soldiers' frontal attack, inflicting most of the U.S. casualties in those early minutes. But then Connor changed tactics. He sent cavalry to attack from the sides and infantry to block escape routes. After about 2 hours of fighting, the Shoshone ran out of ammunition. Once resistance collapsed, the soldiers swept through the lodges. Survivors later said women were raped and the wounded, including children, were executed. Others hid under piles of bodies or burrowed into the riverbanks. By the end, between 250 and 400 Shoshone were dead, most of them women and children, while only about 21 U.S. soldiers were killed. Connor was initially praised as a hero by most, promoted to brigadier general, and went on to lead more campaigns against Native Americans. The Bear River Massacre is remembered as one of the deadliest single killings of Native Americans by U.S. forces, and for generations it was officially called a battle, but Shoshone oral history kept the truth alive. In 1990, the site was declared a National Historic Landmark. Morro Crater Massacre. In March 1906, a volcanic crater on the island of Jolo became the site of one of the worst events of the Philippine-American War during the Moro Rebellion. Between 800 and 1,000 Tausug Moros, many of them ordinary villagers with their families, had taken shelter inside the crater, and for 4 days, U.S. forces under General Leonard Wood launched a full assault with artillery, naval guns, and machine guns. When it was over, only 6 Moros were still alive. Nearly everyone inside, including men, women, and children, were killed. Although the U.S. recorded it as a victory, the level of killing caused outrage. Newspapers carried headlines about the massacre of women and children, and even some U.S. officers who were close to the scene disagreed with General Wood's defense. Major Hugh Scott later said that the people at Bud Dajo had not planned to fight at all. According to him, they had planted crops and were only trying to live in peace, not start an uprising. General Wood justified the attack by claiming that Moro men had used women and children as shields, and that some women had disguised themselves as fighters. Then, Governor General Henry Clay Ide said that the high number of civilian deaths came from the heavy artillery bombardment. However, some battlefield reports described a Maxim machine gun being used to fire straight into the crater, mowing down the people inside. These contradictions led many to believe that the truth was being covered up. On the American side, about 20 soldiers were killed and 70 were wounded. President Theodore Roosevelt sent Wood a congratulatory message, but the press at home turned against him. The Secretary of War demanded answers about what was being called the wanton slaughter of women and children. Wood took responsibility but insisted the attack had been necessary. Buyo Maru lifeboat killings. During World War II, the U.S. submarine Wahoo torpedoed and sank the Japanese transport ship Buyo Maru in the Pacific. What happened afterward, though, turned it into one of the most controversial moments of the war. Survivors crowded into lifeboats and rafts, and instead of leaving them, the Wahoo opened fire. Machine guns swept across the survivors, scattering bodies into the water. The U.S. Navy later gave its official explanation. A vice admiral claimed the crew of the Wahoo had only acted in self-defense. He said the survivors, Japanese soldiers, had fired first with rifles and machine guns, and it was common for armed troops at sea to resist capture. The submarine's executive officer added that their goal was not to massacre people, but to force them out of the lifeboats so they could not regroup and fight again. However, not every account agreed with this version. An historian wrote that the submarine crew had actually fired first, and that only afterward did some survivors shoot back with handguns. The controversy grew even deeper when it became clear who was in the lifeboats. Alongside Japanese troops were almost 270 prisoners of war. In the end, of the 1,126 people originally aboard the Buyo Maru, 195 Indians and 87 Japanese were killed. Some died when the torpedoes hit the ship, but others were killed in the shootings that followed. The U.S. Navy never officially called the incident a war crime, describing it instead as a harsh but necessary part of submarine warfare. Fort Detrick Human Experiments. Behind barbed wire in Maryland, the United States once ran its biological weapons headquarters. From 1943 to 1969, Fort Detrick was the center of the U.S. biological weapons program. Scientists there learned how to grow dangerous germs, test ways to deliver them, and develop methods to contain and sterilize them. After World War II, secrecy was so tight that the public did not even learn about the wartime program until months after Japan surrendered. One of the most disturbing choices tied to the program came right after the war. Researchers from Japan's Unit 731, who had carried out lethal human experiments involving infection, temperature extremes, and much more, which we won't even get into here as that is a whole other story, were given immunity from prosecution. In exchange, their director Shiro Ishii handed over thousands of tissue slides from human and animal dissections. Those materials were reportedly stored at Fort Detrick. The base also became a site for U.S. human testing, and in the same period, Fort Detrick's scientists researched the use of insects to spread disease. A scholar who studied this history wrote that U.S. planners approved insect-based biological warfare for use as early as the fall of 1950 and had multiple agents ready. He concluded it is very likely the United States actually used insects dropped from aircraft during the Korean War. That remains his assessment, though, not an official admission. There were some side effects at the base, too. For example, in the 1950s, workers at the base died from anthrax exposure. Another died in 1964 from viral encephalitis. In 2019, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention identified serious safety failures in Fort Detrick's high containment labs and ordered a halt to operations until fixes were made. The official end to offensive biological weapons research came in 1969, when President Richard Nixon shut the program down, and from then, Fort Detrick's mission shifted to defensive work, such as developing diagnostics, prevention, and treatments, and parts of the campus were transferred to public health and cancer research. Kunduz Hospital Airstrike. This is one of the most recent ones in the video, as it happened on October 3, 2015. On that day, an American military gunship attacked a hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan. This was not a military base. It was a trauma center run by the famous aid group Doctors Without Borders. For about 30 minutes, the aircraft circled overhead, firing repeatedly and precisely at the hospital buildings. The gunship fired 211 shells in total. Inside, the scene was a nightmare. Some patients burned alive in their beds because they could not move. Doctors lost their limbs or were decapitated by shrapnel while trying to operate. As people tried to run from the burning buildings to escape, they were shot from the air. By the time the attack ended, at least 42 people were dead, including doctors, nurses, and patients. The hospital had given its exact GPS coordinates to the U.S. military just days before, specifically to prevent something like this from happening. Even while the bombs were falling, hospital staff were frantically calling military officials, begging them to stop, but the strikes continued. After the attack, the American explanation changed several times. First, officials said they were protecting troops on the ground. Then, they claimed the Afghan army had asked for the strike. Finally, the U.S. commander admitted it was a specific decision made by American forces, but called it a tragic mistake caused by human error and broken equipment. Some officials tried to claim that Taliban fighters were hiding in the hospital, using civilians as human shields. Doctors Without Borders flatly denied this, explaining that they had a strict no-weapons policy and that the compound was full of doctors and patients, not soldiers. In the end, President Obama apologized, and the military punished 16 people with administrative discipline, but no one was ever charged with a crime. The Pentagon concluded that because it was an accident, it was not a war crime. The doctors and the United Nations called for an independent investigation, arguing that a military cannot fairly investigate its own actions, but that investigation never happened. Mahmoudiya killings. On March 12, 2006, in a small house near the village of Yusufia in Iraq, something truly horrific happened. 5 American soldiers from the 502nd Infantry Regiment left their checkpoint and walked to the home of an Iraqi family. The family included a 14-year-old girl called Abir and her 6-year-old sister Hadil and their parents. Their 2 younger brothers were away at school that day. These soldiers had been watching Abir from their nearby checkpoint for some time. They often saw her doing chores in the garden, and some had harassed her before, staring at her or making gestures that scared her family. Her mother had even planned to have Abir sleep at a relative's house to keep her safe. One soldier, Stephen Dale Green, had even touched Abir's face during a house search, which terrified her. Green himself had told a reporter just a month earlier that killing people in Iraq felt like nothing to him, like squashing an ant, and that he had come there wanting to kill. That day, the soldiers were drinking alcohol mixed with energy drinks, playing cards, and talking about doing what can't be said here to Abir and killing Iraqis. Green kept pushing the idea. 4 of them changed their looks to look less like U.S. soldiers, and they headed to the house in broad daylight. Brian L. Howard stayed at the checkpoint, but knew what was planned. They separated the family into different rooms. One of them grabbed the little sister who was outside, while another one shot and killed the parents and the sister. The mother struggled, and her arms were broken. Then, two soldiers took turns doing what they had planned to Abir. The soldier who shot the family came in after killing the others, said he had just killed them all, and called it awesome. He then did the same thing as the other two soldiers to Abir, and then killed her. To cover it up, they poured petrol on her body and set fire to the lower part. The fire spread, and they burned their bloody clothes too, throwing the murder weapon into a canal. Afterwards, they went back and ate chicken wings to celebrate. Neighbors saw the smoke and rushed over. One described seeing the poor girl's body. They told Abir's uncle, who put out some flames to get inside, and saw the terrible scene. The surviving brothers, 9-year-old Ahmed and 11-year-old Muhammad, came home from school to find their house burning and their family gone. They were left orphans, raised by their uncle. The soldiers tried to blame Sunni insurgents at first, and for a while, no one investigated deeply, but the crime led to revenge attacks. Militant groups claimed they kidnapped and killed American soldiers from the same unit to avenge Abir, releasing videos of the bodies. The truth came out months later when another soldier in the unit, Justin Watt, heard about it from others and decided to report it, even though he feared his comrades might hurt him for speaking up. Investigations started, and the soldiers were arrested. Green had already left the army for mental issues, so he was tried in a civilian court. He was found guilty of rape and murder, but got life in prison instead of death because the jury could not agree on the death penalty. He later died in prison by suicide. The others faced military trials. Barker pleaded guilty, admitted hating Iraqis, and got 90 years with possible parole after 10. Cortez also pleaded guilty, apologized in tears for the pain he caused, and got 100 years with possible parole after 10. Spielman was convicted and sentenced to 110 years with possible parole after 10. Howard, who helped cover it up, got 27 months. Another soldier who knew but did not report was discharged. Canacattì Massacre. American troops had just entered the town of Canacattì in Sicily. The German army had retreated, leaving behind a lot of destruction. So desperate and hungry, local people gathered at a bombed-out factory to take whatever supplies they could find. They were filling buckets with food and liquid soap just to survive the chaos. An American commander named Colonel McCaffrey arrived at the scene. He was supposed to be in charge of keeping order. Instead, when he saw the crowd, he demanded they leave immediately. When the people didn't move fast enough, the colonel ordered his own soldiers to fire into the crowd of unarmed families. But the soldiers refused to shoot, as they saw that these were just civilians. Furious, Colonel McCaffrey pulled out his own handgun and started shooting people himself. He killed at least 8 innocent people, including an 11-year-old girl. The most shocking part is that the colonel got away with it. He was never punished and lived for another decade before dying of natural causes. For years, this massacre was completely forgotten, and the truth only came out because the son of a witness finally decided to tell the world what he had seen. Tiger Force atrocities. The Tiger Force started as a small group of elite soldiers in Vietnam, trained to be fast and deadly. But by May 1967, this unit had turned into something monstrous. The mission was supposed to be about finding guerrilla fighters, but it became something totally different. The commanders wanted high numbers of enemy kills, and one colonel even ordered the troops to reach a specific number of kills to match the unit's name. This created an environment where soldiers felt like they had a license to kill anyone they saw. For 7 months, they went on a rampage where unarmed people were hunted down and killed, even if they weren't guerrilla fighters. The reports from that time describe a nightmare. Soldiers were executing elderly people and women in the rice fields as they begged for their lives. They threw grenades into underground shelters where families were hiding, turning those bunkers into mass graves. Prisoners were tortured and executed routinely. Some soldiers began cutting off the ears of the dead and wearing them on necklaces as trophies. 2 friends from Arizona, Sammy Barra and Ken Green, became the symbols of all of this. After Green was killed in battle, Ibarra went over the edge and started mutilating bodies. Instead of being punished, Ibarra was actually congratulated in a military newspaper for getting the unit's 1,000th kill. Not everyone went along with what was happening, though. A soldier named Gerald Bruner actually pointed his rifle at a fellow soldier to stop a killing, but his commanders treated him like he was the problem. Others who tried to report the crimes were told to keep quiet. One military journalist was threatened with death by his own commander if he spoke up. Even the medical staff suspected what was happening, but were too afraid to investigate. Years later, though, the army actually did investigate. From 1971 to 1975, they gathered sworn statements from soldiers who admitted to the crimes. They found proof of routine murder, including the killing of 2 blind brothers and many civilians. However, in the end, nobody was punished. Some think it was because by 1975 the war was ending, and the government wanted to move on. Likely afraid of a massive scandal, the files were buried. It took decades for reporters to uncover the truth. They went back to Vietnam, found the old grave sites, and spoke to witnesses. Al Hamdaniya murder. On April 26, 2006, a group of U.S. Marines went into a small village in Iraq called Al-Hamdaniya, not to fight, but to look for an insurgent. However, when they couldn't find him, they made a decision to just get someone else. There was someone called by the locals as Hashim the Lam, a disabled man who walked with a metal bar in his leg and had poor eyesight. The Marines broke into his house while he was asleep and dragged him away from his family. Before they grabbed him, they stole a shovel and an AK-47 from a neighbor's yard to use as props. They tied the disabled man's hands, forced him to walk to a hole in the road, and shot him to death. To cover their tracks, they fired the stolen gun into the air to make it sound like a battle was happening. Then, they untied his hands, planted the shovel and the rifle next to his body, and filed a false report claiming they had shot a terrorist who was digging a roadside bomb. When his family found him the next morning, he had been shot in the mouth, and his face was so swollen and beaten that he was almost unrecognizable. The truth eventually came out, and 7 Marines and 1 Navy medic were charged with murder and kidnapping. However, the justice system struggled to hold them accountable. Most of the men made deals to testify against each other in exchange for lighter punishments. The leader of the group was convicted of murder and sentenced to 15 years, but that conviction was later overturned due to legal errors. He was retried and convicted again, but in the end, the jury decided he didn't need to serve any more prison time. Gorla Massacre. On October 20th, 1944, children at an elementary school in Milan were running down the stairs toward the air raid shelter while bombs were being dropped on the city when a sudden explosion caused a tragedy. At the time, Milan was heavily bombed because it was one of Italy's most important industrial cities, and its factories were useful for supporting the war. The 451st Bombing Group of the 15th Air Force was assigned to bomb Milan, even though it was known to have a poor record, since earlier in the war, planes from the same group had accidentally bombed the town of Venafro, killing 40 Italian civilians and 17 Allied soldiers. Although they were investigated and criticized, no officers were punished because commanders feared it would hurt morale in future operations. Nonetheless, on the morning of October 20th, 1944, 111 American bombers took off from southern Italy. 2 bomber groups hit their assigned targets, and then it was the 451st Bombing Group's turn. They were supposed to strike the Breda factory. The lead aircraft made a fatal navigation mistake. Instead of turning left toward the target, it turned right, sending the bombers directly over the densely populated neighborhoods of Gorla and Prakoto. Realizing they could no longer reach the factory, the lead plane still dropped its bombs and ordered the others to do the same. All the bombs from the second wave fell on civilian areas. This attack, later known as the Gorla Massacre, killed about 614 civilians. Among the dead were 184 children who were inside the Francesco Crispi primary school when the bombs hit. Air raid sirens had sounded earlier, but many people didn't have enough time to reach shelters. After the bombing, there was internal criticism of the 451st Bombing Group, but there were no real consequences. No one was punished, and Milan was devastated. The children came to be known as the Little Martyrs of Gorla. Fascist authorities used the bombing for propaganda, calling the Allies murderers of children. Thuibo killings. On January 31st, Company H of the 2nd Battalion 1st Marines approached the small village of Thuibo at midday. Suddenly, they came under heavy fire, including from a .50 caliber machine gun. Pinned down, their captain, Edward Banks, called in airstrikes and artillery and asked for reinforcements. Even with help, though, they could not advance and stayed under fire until nightfall. At first light the next morning, the company pushed into the village. What happened next is where the stories split apart. Vietnamese communist sources say it was a massacre, and a village memorial lists 145 civilians killed, mostly women, children, and elderly men. U.S. sources, on the other hand, say 22 civilians died during 2 days of combat. The Marines reported 5 dead and 26 wounded in their own ranks, an estimated 101 Viet Cong killed. Captain Banks said it was impossible to tell who was enemy and who was friend. He claimed villagers sometimes watched booby traps go off without warning Marines. Overall, he described the mission as a search and destroy operation and denied a massacre. He insisted the Viet Cong used human shields and argued that, at most, 10 to 15 civilians may have been killed during the assault. He said he shouted for his men to stop firing when the enemy's fire ended. Some of his men, though, remembered things differently. Marine Jack Hill said the number of dead was ridiculous for a village they had thought was friendly. He said that the next day their orders were to sweep the village. Hill described forcing people from hiding by throwing grenades into bunkers. He explained that the language barrier and the pressure of war had a role in those choices. Villagers told yet other versions. A 14-year-old said jets and artillery struck first, then troops came, asked if people were Viet Cong, and shot them. Others said only women, children, and old men were present, and that short bursts of gunfire cut them down while they ate or pressed sugarcane. One woman said a grenade thrown into her house killed 10 family members, and that soldiers fired again into the corpses. Another said that a neighbor who had just given birth was killed, and her baby too, in a brutal way. One villager said babies clung to dead mothers' bodies when the shooting stopped, and that the living carried corpses to nearby posts to demand the killing end. Some said Marines later ordered them to dig up buried bodies to look for Viet Cong. When asked about claims that women and children were forced into a shelter and a grenade thrown inside, Hill said he could not confirm it. He described mass confusion and crying. The Marines battalion reviewed the 22 corpses and 18 wounded people brought to their command post and called these deaths an unfortunate side effect of the battle. Villagers insisted many were executed at close range after the Viet Cong had already left. The numbers remain disputed. Biscari Massacre. On July 14, 1943, during the invasion of Sicily, American soldiers, in two separate incidents on the same day, executed 73 prisoners of war. In the first incident, a sergeant named Horace West was ordered to take a group of prisoners to the rear. Instead, he marched them about a mile away and stopped. He borrowed a Tommy gun and told his fellow American guards to turn away if they did not want to watch what he was about to do. He then opened fire on the unarmed men. Investigators later found that he had shot them through the heart. The most chilling detail is that after his gun ran empty, West reloaded it and walked among the bodies, shooting the wounded men who were still moving to make sure they were dead. 37 bodies were left lying on the ground. Later that same day, a captain named John Compton was angry because snipers had been shooting at his men. When his troops captured a group of 36 Italians who were hiding in a ditch, they brought them to the captain. The prisoners begged for their lives, but the captain gave a direct order to a firing squad. He told his men he did not want anyone left standing. When the prisoners tried to run, the Americans opened fire and killed all of them. When the news reached the top commanders, at first, the famous General George Patton tried to cover it up. He wrote in his diary that they should just lie and say the men were snipers killed in combat to avoid a scandal. However, other officers refused to stay silent, and Patton himself, once he learned the details, that the prisoners had offered no provocation and were essentially being slaughtered, said, "Try those bastards." Both the sergeant and the captain were put on trial. The sergeant was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, while the captain was found not guilty, claiming he was just following orders. Soldiers claimed that those orders came from Patton himself, who, according to their versions, said not to take prisoners if enemy combatants continued to resist within 200 yards of their position. The story has a shocking ending. The sergeant never actually served his life sentence. After the noise died down, the army quietly released him a year later. He was allowed to return to duty and was eventually given an honorable discharge. Torture in Operation Teardrop. It was the final weeks of World War II, and a terrifying rumor was spreading through the US military. Leaders believed that German submarines were crossing the Atlantic, carrying flying bombs or rockets aimed directly at New York City. The mayor of New York had even warned the public that attacks were coming. In response, the US Navy launched a massive mission called Operation Teardrop to hunt down these boats before they could reach the coast. The fighting in the North Atlantic was brutal. During the battle, a German submarine named U-546 managed to sink an American destroyer, killing most of the crew. The Americans responded with fury, hunting the German boat for 10 hours until they forced it to the surface and sank it. They pulled 33 German survivors from the water, including the captain, Paul Just. However, instead of treating them like normal prisoners of war, the Americans were driven by panic. They needed to know if more submarines were coming with missiles. They separated 8 specific crew members, labeled them as specialists, and took them to a base in Newfoundland. There, the interrogators used what they called shock interrogation. They threw the men into solitary confinement, beat them, and forced them to do exhausting physical exercises until they broke. The treatment was so harsh that the German captain eventually collapsed unconscious. This torture continued even after the war in Europe had officially ended. Historians later described this as a singular atrocity. The tragedy is that it was all for nothing. After the war, investigators confirmed that the submarines never carried any missiles. The weapons that the Americans were so afraid of did not exist on those boats. Kandahar Massacre. During the war in Afghanistan, on an ordinary night, families went to sleep as usual, but they were suddenly woken by flashlights and gunfire. What happened is that on March 11, 2012, U.S. Army Staff Sergeant Robert Bales walked into Afghan villages before dawn. U.S. investigators concluded that he didn't leave the base just once, but twice that night. First going to Al-Qazai, where he killed 4 and wounded 6, and then to Najiban, where he killed 12, including most of one family. Witnesses said some victims were pulled from sleep and shot in the head. They also described a woman dragged dragged and beaten and more graphic stuff, which we won't go into detail for obvious reasons. In one home, bodies were gathered into a room and set on fire. By the end, Bales had murdered 16 civilians, 9 of which were children, and 11 came from the same family. Bales returned to his base later that morning and said, "I did it." Afghan officials called it intentional murder, and the US and NATO issued apologies. Protests erupted, and the Afghan parliament demanded a public trial in Kabul, but US officials said he would be tried under American military law. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, and he was also reduced to the lowest rank, dishonorably discharged, and stripped of all pay and benefits. Dachau Liberation Reprisals. On April 29, 1945, American soldiers reached the Dachau concentration camp, and they walked into a nightmare. This was not just a normal military target. They found train cars packed with thousands of skeletons, bodies piled from the floor to the ceiling, and survivors who were starving and barely alive. Just days before, the guards had forced thousands of prisoners on a death march. The American soldiers were shocked and furious, and in that atmosphere, discipline completely collapsed. What happened next is known as the Dachau Reprisals. Enraged American soldiers and the liberated prisoners themselves began killing the German SS guards. Historians estimate that between 35 and 50 guards were killed that day. The killings happened in chaos. One American commander, Colonel Felix Sparks, later described a moment in a coal yard where a machine gunner opened fire on surrendered prisoners. Sparks ran over and physically stopped the gunner, but about a dozen men were already dead. In other parts of the camp, guards were shot near walls and guard towers without any trial. At the same time, the prisoners took their own revenge. They swarmed the guards, beating them with shovels, sticks, and their bare fists, or stomping them to death. In many cases, the American soldiers stood by and watched, deliberately looking the other way. The US Army actually investigated these killings immediately. A report confirmed that surrendered guards had been shot and that wounded men were left without medical care. Serious charges were considered, even against officers. However, General George Patton, the same general we talked about in the Biscari massacre, dismissed the case. The legal review argued that because the horrors discovered at Dachau were so extreme, it was unjust to punish the soldiers for snapping. In the end, no one was ever punished. Lipach Massacre. On April 22, 1945, near the German village of Lipach, American soldiers committed a brutal war crime that is rarely discussed. The day began with a harsh battle. American tanks attacked a group of German SS troops who held them off for hours with rockets and artillery. The Americans eventually broke through, but the real horror began after the main battle was over. While the rest of the army moved on, a smaller unit of American soldiers stayed behind in the village. They discovered a warehouse full of alcohol, and many of them got drunk. According to accounts, about 25 of these intoxicated soldiers then turned their rage on the prisoners they had captured. In total, 36 German soldiers died, and historians believe about 16 of them were executed after they had already surrendered. The details of the killings are gruesome. 10 prisoners were marched out to a meadow and shot in the back of the head. 6 others had their skulls crushed. What makes this even more shocking is who these victims were. The German soldiers were incredibly young, with an average age of just 16. They were essentially teenagers. The violence did not stop with the executions. The same group of American soldiers is accused of raping around 20 women in the village that same night. These crimes happened during the chaotic final rush to win the war, and there was no real accountability at the time. Sun Thang Massacre. Imagine a soldier getting sentenced to life in prison for murdering women and children, but then serving less than a year because a general decided to let him go early. This is the story of the Sun Thang Massacre, which took place in Vietnam on February 19, 1970. Tensions were high because a week earlier, a Viet Cong ambush had killed 9 US Marines. To get revenge, a lieutenant sent out 5 soldiers, ordering them to avenge the Marines' deaths. They went to a hamlet called Sun Thang, which was about 2 miles from their base, and when they arrived, they found 3 small huts. The soldiers ordered the people inside to come out. The inhabitants were just women and young children. Nonetheless, their team leader ordered them to shoot, and they killed everyone. They went to a second hut and did the same thing, then moved to a third hut and killed the people there too. In total, they killed 7 women and 9 children. When the team got back to base, they lied and reported that they had been in a firefight with 15 to 20 Viet Cong soldiers. However, the next morning, Vietnamese civilians told another Marine patrol what happened, and they found the bodies. The truth came out, and charges were brought against the Marines. One member of the team agreed to help the prosecution. During the trials, the leader and another soldier were acquitted, but a soldier named Schwartz was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to life in prison with hard labor. Another one, called Green, was found guilty of unpremeditated murder and sentenced to 5 years. He himself was surprised by how short his sentence was and even asked, 5 years for that? However, they did not even serve that much time. Major General Charles F. Whittock reduced both sentences to less than 1 year, and they were released in 1971. Greene eventually shot himself in 1975, while Herod wrote a book about the event and lived until 2017. Raid on Catawba. A family was celebrating the birth of a newborn baby when American soldiers burst in and opened fire, killing 7 people, including 2 pregnant women. This happened on February 12, 2010, in the village of Catawba, Afghanistan. A family had gathered at the home of a police officer named Mohammed Daoud Sharabuddin to celebrate the naming of his son. The family was not associated with the Taliban. In fact, Daoud was a police commander who had been trained by the Americans. Around 3:30 in the morning, Daoud and his 15-year-old son went outside to investigate noises and were immediately shot by snipers. The rest of the family rushed out in panic, and in the chaos, U.S. Army Rangers killed 5 civilians. The dead included 2 pregnant women and a teenage girl. Afterward, NATO released a story claiming that the soldiers had stumbled upon a gruesome scene where 3 women had been bound, gagged, and executed by family members in an honor killing. However, survivors told a very different story. They said they saw American soldiers using knives to dig bullets out of the women's bodies to hide the evidence. An investigation by a British reporter named Jerome Starkey forced the military to admit that the honor-killing story was false. Months later, Vice Admiral William McRaven visited the village to apologize and offer sheep as a traditional condolence. Despite this, an internal investigation concluded that the soldiers had followed the rules of engagement, and none of them faced any disciplinary action. Thanh Phong Seals Massacre. Bob Kerrey was a man who served as a Navy SEAL in Vietnam, and then became a U.S. Senator. In this story, when he started reading secret documents about his own past, his hands reportedly started shaking. In early 1969, he led a commando team known as Kerry's Raiders on a mission to a tiny peasant village called Thanh Phong in Vietnam. The village was considered a free fire zone, and their goal was to target a Viet Cong leader who intelligence suggested would be holding a meeting there. What happened that night became a dark secret that haunted Kerry for more than 30 years. According to reports, shortly after midnight, the team killed at least 13 unarmed women and children. There are 2 very different stories about how this tragedy unfolded. Kerry claimed that his team took fire from the village and shot back from a distance, only to discover later that they had killed civilians instead of soldiers. He described the horror of walking in and finding about 14 dead women and children when he expected to find armed guerrillas. However, a member of his team named Gerhard Klan tells a much more disturbing story. Klan claims that the team rounded up the civilians and decided to kill them all so they could not alert the enemy, and he stated that Kerry gave the order to open fire. Survivors from the village also shared their accounts. A woman said she hid in a banana grove and watched the soldiers kill 5 civilians. Another survivor, who was 12 years old at the time, said 7 men entered a hut where 16 people were hiding. She said they used gunfire and an explosive device to kill the occupants, including 5 of her relatives, and she was the only one to survive. Years later, a museum in Vietnam displayed a drain pipe where 3 children reportedly hid before they were found and killed. In 2001, Kerry finally addressed the incident publicly in a speech. He admitted that he used lethal procedures when there was doubt and acknowledged that he had ordered the operation, calling it a tragedy that he could never make peace with. Despite the civilian deaths, the unit filed a report at the time claiming they had killed 21 Viet Cong soldiers and captured weapons. Kerry was even awarded a Bronze Star based on this false report. He later said, "Though it could be justified militarily, I could never make my own peace with what happened that night. I have been haunted by it for 32 years. Habibullah and Dilawar. In 2005, a massive 2,000-page government report was leaked to the New York Times revealing a pattern of torture and homicide inside a United States military prison in Afghanistan. This nightmare unfolded in December 2002 at the Bagram Theater internment facility. Inside those walls, 2 prisoners named Habibullah and Dilawar were beaten to death within a week of each other. Soldiers struck Habibullah repeatedly with what they called peroneal strikes, which are severe blows to the side of the leg above the knee that destroy the nerves. A few days later, Dilawar, a young taxi driver who weighed only 122 pounds, died as well. For days, guards chained him to the ceiling and pummeled his legs until they could no longer bend. When they hit him, he would cry out, "Allah!" and the soldiers found this amusing. It became a running joke where troops would show up just to hit him and hear the noise. Over a 24-hour period, he was struck over 100 times. By the time a doctor finally saw him, he was dead. The abuse was so severe that medical examiners later said his legs looked like they had been run over by a bus. To make matters worse, investigators later learned that most interrogators officers believed Dilawar was actually an innocent man who simply drove his taxi past the base at the wrong time. Other prisoners suffered too, including a man named Haji Mumin who was shocked with electricity, and a female prisoner named Afia Siddiqui, known as Prisoner 650, who kept others awake with her haunting sobs. While 27 officers and soldiers were investigated, the punishments were considered by many as surprisingly light, with some serving only a few months in prison or receiving simple reprimands. Xinhua shooting. Imagine being stuck in a traffic jam on a busy highway when suddenly a car bomb explodes, and the soldiers who were targeted start speeding down the road, firing machine guns at everyone in their way for miles. This terrifying scene is what witnesses describe happening on March 4, 2007, in the Xinhua district of Afghanistan. A minivan driven by a suicide bomber slammed into a U.S. Marine convoy, injuring one soldier. What happened next is disputed, but according to many Afghan witnesses and human rights groups, the Marines fled the scene while indiscriminately firing their weapons at passing civilians, vehicles, and pedestrians for anywhere between 6 to 16 miles. Initial reports claimed as many as 19 civilians were killed and around 50 were injured, including elderly men, women, and children. One local reporter said the Marines sprayed civilians with machine gun fire, even though they were not under attack. There were also reports that U.S. troops confiscated cameras from journalists and deleted photos, with one soldier allegedly telling a photographer, "Delete them, or we will delete you." The U.S. military initially apologized, calling it a terrible mistake. However, a later inquiry by the Marine Corps cleared the soldiers of any criminal wrongdoing. The inquiry concluded that the Marines had come under a complex ambush and acted appropriately. It found that only 5 to 7 adult men were killed and claimed witness testimony was vague and contradictory. No criminal charges were ever brought against the officers involved. In fact, in 2019, a board recommended that the commander of the unit be retroactively promoted and given back pay, stating that the only mistake was senior leaders failing to stand by their troops. This decision angered Afghan officials and human rights organizations who felt that justice was never served for the victims of the shooting. The Baghuz strikes. Drone operators sitting in a base in Qatar watched in shock as American jets dropped bombs on a crowd of people they had identified as civilians. This happened on March 18, 2019, in Syria during a fight against the Islamic State known as the Battle of Baghuz Fakhani. A secret American special operations unit called Talon Anvil called in an airstrike on a group of people near the Euphrates River. These people were mostly women and children trying to escape the fighting. Even though drone operators saw who they were, the unit ordered to drop a 500-pound bomb on the crowd. Then, they dropped a second bomb that weighed 2,000 pounds on the survivors. The New York Times reported that 80 people were killed and 64 of them were civilians, which would make it one of the largest civilian casualty incidents of that war. The next day, observers saw piles of dead women and children, and the strike area was bulldozed shortly after. The U.S. military concealed this incident for years, and the official military count of civilian deaths for all of 2019 was only 22 and did not include this attack. Senior officials never reviewed the strike until the New York Times exposed it in November 2021. An Air Force legal officer named Dean Corsack said this could be a possible war crime. In May 2022, a U.S. military investigation concluded that the strike actually killed 52 enemy fighters and only 4 civilians, and said it did not violate the laws of war. Wardak/Nurk killings. In the spring of 2013, a shepherd was walking near an abandoned military base when he stumbled upon human remains, only to realize the ground around him was filled with the bodies of missing villagers. This happened in the Nurk district in Afghanistan. For months, local residents had been terrified because men were disappearing after being taken into custody by a U.S. Special Forces unit known as ODA 3124. In February 2013, the body of a man named Nasratullah was found with his throat slit after he had been arrested by U.S. forces. Tensions got so high that Afghan President Hamid Karzai demanded that U.S. forces leave the province. It was after the American unit withdrew in April that the shepherd found the remains near their former base perimeter. Villagers began to dig in the area and found bodies in 5 other locations nearby. Some bodies were intact while others were just parts, but they were identified as 10 men who had been captured by the Americans. In total, 18 men were killed during operations linked to this specific Special Forces team. Witnesses who had been detained by the unit told horrific stories of what happened inside the base. One former prisoner said he was held for 45 days and subjected to electric shocks, near drowning, and severe beatings. He even described being nearly buried alive. This witness claimed he saw an American soldier, described as a big guy with a bushy red beard and green eyes, beat a prisoner named Sayed Muhammad to death. Another detainee said he watched an Afghan interpreter execute a neighbor right in front of U.S. personnel who did nothing to stop him. When the bodies were first discovered, U.S. officials denied any American involvement and tried to place all the blame on the interpreter. However, the Red Cross provided new evidence, and Rolling Stone magazine published an investigation that forced the U.S. military to open a criminal inquiry. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have pointed out that despite abundant evidence of war crimes, the U.S. military justice system has a poor record of holding soldiers accountable. As of the time these reports were released, the families of the 18 murdered men were still waiting for justice. Marias Massacre. On January 23, 1870, an entire village woke up to the sound of barking dogs, only to realize that soldiers had surrounded their camp in the freezing cold. This ended up in a massacre of people who were already sick and dying. This took place in Montana Territory. U.S. Army forces led by Major Eugene Baker were looking for a hostile band of Piegan Blackfeet, led by Mountain Chief. Instead, they found a camp led by Chief Heavy Runner, who had been promised protection by the U.S. government. Most of the men were out hunting, so the camp was filled with women, children, and elderly people, many of whom were suffering from smallpox. A scout named Joe Kipp recognized the camp and told Major Baker it was the wrong group. Baker replied that it made no difference and ordered his men to attack. He even threatened to shoot Kipp if he tried to warn the sleeping villagers. When the attack started, Chief Heavy Runner ran toward the soldiers, waving his safe conduct paper from the government, but he was immediately shot and killed. Soldiers fired into the lodges where people were sleeping, then charged in with axes and knives. Survivors described horrifying scenes. One woman remembered soldiers cutting holes in the lodges and shooting anyone who moved inside. Another saw them collapse, burning tents onto wounded people. In the end, approximately 200 Native people were killed. Despite the brutality, the government initially tried to cover it up, with Baker claiming most of the dead were warriors. However, reports from the Indian agent revealed the truth, that most of the victims were women and children. This caused public outrage and forced President Ulysses S. Grant to shift toward a peace policy, ending discussions about giving the Army control over Indian affairs. Jungholzhausen Massacre. On April 15, 1945, when the smoke cleared after a brutal battle, villagers went out to count the dead, and they found 63 bodies, mostly teenage soldiers. But they noticed something really disturbing. They realized that the wounds on many of the men didn't happen during the fight. The U.S. Army was fighting against German combat engineers and a group of Waffen-SS soldiers who were mostly just 17 years old. It turned out that between 13 and 30 of them were killed after they had already surrendered. Some estimates say the number could be as high as 48. One eyewitness watched as American soldiers used submachine guns to execute 4 SS troops during the night. For decades, this event was kept quiet and shrouded in silence. It was not until the 1990s that local German newspapers started reporting on what really happened. The United States Army Criminal Investigation Command finally launched an investigation in 1996 to look into the massacre. However, they were unable to identify the specific soldiers who committed the crimes. Chinon Massacre. One of the most famous American generals in history wrote a secret note in his diary, hoping to hide a mass murder committed by his own troops, but the truth eventually came out. A few weeks before January 1, 1945, German SS troops had slaughtered 84 American prisoners at Malmedy, so the situation was tense. Some units were issued orders that SS troops and paratroopers were not to be taken prisoner, but were to be shot on sight. In the village of Chinon, the fighting was brutal, with the town changing hands 5 times and almost every house being destroyed. When the 11th Armored Division finally cleared the village, they found German soldiers hiding in cellars. About 20 of them were dragged out and shot immediately, even though they tried to surrender. The killing didn't stop there. An eyewitness watched as American troops marched another group of about 60 German prisoners up a hill. He saw machine guns being set up and realized the prisoners were going to be murdered. He later walked back down the road and saw lifeless bodies lying in the snow, noting that the Americans were committing the same crimes they accused the Germans and Japanese of doing. General Eisenhower heard about the killings and demanded a full investigation, but the officers of the 11th Armored Division refused to cooperate, claiming it was too late because the war was over. The general who wrote that diary entry was George S. Patton. On January 4th, he wrote that his men had murdered about 50 Germans and noted that he hoped they could conceal it. In the end, nobody was ever punished for the massacre, and a lawyer who served as a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials later looked at the files and said it smelled like a cover-up. Bismarck Sea Killings. In March 1943, thousands of Japanese sailors and soldiers were floating in the ocean after their ship sank, thinking the battle was over, only to see American planes and boats suddenly come back with unknown intentions. This happened during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. A large Japanese convoy was trying to transport thousands of troops to New Guinea to fight, but Allied forces intercepted them. In a short time, all 8 transport ships and 4 destroyers were sinking or destroyed. Usually, once a ship sinks, the battle for those sailors is considered over. However, this time, the Allied military military leadership decided that wasn't enough. They justified their next actions by saying that if these men were rescued, they would just be landed at their destination and return to fight immediately. There was also anger because Japanese pilots had shot at American airmen, parachuting from their planes earlier in the fight. So, the order was given to destroy everything. That night, U.S. Navy PT boats went into the area and fired at rescue vessels and survivors in the dark. Then, when the sun came up, the planes returned. They shot at lifeboats, rafts, and even individual men swimming in the sea. The attacks were so intense that the water around the wreckage was filled with blood. The attacks on the helpless men went on for days.